The Magic Jug by Friedrich Wilhelm Hackländer. On a high mountain there was once a beautiful, stately castle with strong towers, surrounded by extensive walls and deep ditches, over which hung heavy drawbridges, and with a huge castle gate, above which the coat of arms of the brave count was carved on a large stone, to which the mountain and castle belonged. The name of the castle cannot be specified exactly, but it is also irrelevant, for the walls and towers of it have been broken, so that no stone lies on top of another, only the family that lived in it, it was that of the Schreckenberg, is important and worth remembering, since it did not perish with the destruction of the castle, but a young branch of this famous tribe was saved quite accidentally. The Schreckenbergs had lived up to their name from time immemorial, for when a procession of merchants or other tradesmen had to approach this mountain, they did so only with terror, and were not wrong in doing so. For a falcon is not more easily aware of a dove than those up. They're from their high watchtower the features of the shopkeepers. Even if they marched at night for the sake of greater safety, in order to escape the dreaded Schreckenbergers in the dark, it was neat, as if those up there were connected with the evil spirits, for never before had armed troops succeeded in bringing the shopkeepers who took refuge in their shelter unharmed, and the neighbouring towns had often joined forces and toiled for months to run against the castle of the Schreckenberger from all sides, but always in vain. In such attempts the good citizens always saw sooner or later that it would be better to leave the Schreckenberger now and then a bale of silk for his illustrious wife, or a cart of skins for the squires, than to expose themselves to the bales of his throwing machines, and thus carry their own skins to market. The last of the highly respectable and world-famous family of the Schreckenberg was Grimm von Schreckenberg, and probably the worst and most predatory who ever lived. But in spite of this, he was more popular than his ancestors. He never let a train of merchants pass without stealing from them, but he also left them something for it, and was usually content with half the goods. He never dragged the merchants themselves or their brushwood, which he managed with him to his castle, and as long as Grimm lived up there, the castle dungeon was always empty. Nor did he roam about the land like his ancestors, but sat like a spider in its web on his mountain, and took only what came within his reach. In addition to his natural good nature, this course of action was also due to an evil prophecy, which had been made to one of his ancestors, and which Grimm von Schreckenberg described as the one under whom the castle was to be destroyed, so that no stone would be left upon another. But what again drew the attention of Herr von Schreckenberg to this prophecy in later years, and not infrequently made him very sad, was the death of his very beloved and good wife. Franz had not entered into the state of holy marriage until he had already become a man, but was not to enjoy the happiness of being in the possession of so good a woman for long. For after his wife bore him a little son, whom he had baptized Kuno, she lived only 1 year longer, and then went to heaven, where she really belonged because of her piety. But what reminded the noble knight so much of the old prophecy at the death of his wife was a dream which the lady had had 3 times shortly before her death. For she dreamed that she was watching from heaven as the castle stood in bright flames. She heard the roar of the wall breakers, the cries of the stormers. She saw her husband fight bravely, and then fall with the sword in his hand. But immediately afterwards she had the consolation of seeing him united to herself in heaven. It was not so with her child, poor Kuno. She distinctly saw the chamber where the little one had hidden himself in a large chair amid the noise. She saw how his nurses ran away in terror and left him alone. She trembled violently as the fire and the noise approached, and there was almost no way out for the child. Then suddenly she saw the little one look up attentively and run into a corner of the room, where stood a large copper jug that she had never seen before. The child seized the handle of it, and it was as if the jug suddenly ran away and dragged the boy behind it. So she saw him float away down the burning stairs, over the shattered drawbridge and the broken walls into the open air, where the boy with the jug suddenly disappeared. As I said, the poor woman dreamed the same story 3 times, exactly once as the other time. She told this dream at length to her husband, who was not very uplifted by it. But he composed himself and thought, as a wise man, "No one can escape his fate, not even I, so let us wait for what comes." At the request of the sick countess, they had searched all the corners of the castle for a jug that bore some resemblance to the one she had seen in her dream, and had actually found one among the old junk. It was an ancient copper vessel that had often been seen lying there, and which no one had thought of before. Now, of course, it was brought out, cleaned of dust and dirt. And then it was found that on the belly of this jug were all sorts of beautiful shields, coats of arms, tournaments, battles, and the like. By order of the countess, the jug was now formally made the playmate of little Kuno, who was also not a little pleased about this new acquaintance. It was as if the child knew how important this device would one day become to him according to her mother's dream, for when it was once given to her, she did not let him go, and could converse with it for hours, following with her little finger the wonderful drawings that were on the jug. It was as if the poor countess's feeble life had hitherto hesitated to leave her body, and as if she really believed that the jug would one day become her child's guardian spirit. Enough, she became calmer from day to day, since she found it, and shortly afterwards closed her eyes to leave this corrupt world and rise to the better pleasures of heaven. The Count was, of course, very much saddened by the death of his wife, and even seemed to have lost all desire to resume his former raids. The squire on the highest tower of the castle spied in vain whole trains of travelling merchants. His master, who was thinking of the evil prophecy, had no desire to call upon the vengeance of heaven by evil deeds to remember it before it was good for herself. On the contrary, he did everything he could to make himself smell good on earth in heaven, made endowments, gave poor pilgrims the most abundant gifts, and lived quietly and withdrawn for himself. It was now a greater pleasure for him to sit with little Kuno and drink from that copper jug of the best wine in his cellar than to ride about and rob out in the fields and bushes. He could now talk for hours about his former journeys, or play with the child until the wine exerted a stupefying power on him, and he fell asleep quietly. This latter often happened to him, and when he drank from that vessel, he had far more pleasant dreams than usual. Then he fared well like his deceased wife, and dreamed of the ruin of his castle, but then he constantly saw growing out of the rubble and ruins one of those flowers called mullein, which rose straight and proud above all the grasses and flowers that grew around it. Little Kuno was now 10 years old, and as the old Count of Schreckenberg no longer disturbed the townspeople, nor had any enemies among the neighbouring knights, he gradually began to remember his wife's dream, as well as the prophecy, as something improbable. Unfortunately, he was not allowed to abandon himself to this reassuring belief for long, for suddenly neighbouring rough peoples fell into the country, and a general bloody war ensued. Now Grimm's Schreckenberg knew well what the hour had struck. He called his men and brushwood, and chose some of the best among them, with whose help he buried his treasures. After he had lavishly presented the men with presents, he made them bound by a solemn oath that if he did not escape with his life, they should take care of his son. Then the castle was fortified as far as it could, and the Count calmly awaited his further fate, which was also quickly and sadly fulfilled. Everything happened as the late Countess had seen it in her dream. The castle was stormed. Count Fratz von Schreckenberg fell, after he had fought like a lion, and with him the best of his men. Yes, even all those who had formerly taken the oath to him concerning his son, for they preferred to keep the first oath they had sworn to their master, that of fidelity, after which they stood with him, fell and died. The walls of the castle were broken, so that not one stone was left upon another, and as poor Kuno's nurses followed the principle, every man for himself, They left the poor child in the lurch, and not a living soul knew what had become of him. As in this way all the evil that the Countess had foreseen happened, so the good of her dream was fulfilled for poor Kuno's good, and the boy was saved in a wonderful and inexplicable way. When the noise broke out around the castle, he had at first listened without fear to the sound of the horns and the shouts of the stormers. But this childish joy lasted only until the windows of the chamber in which he was were reddened by the flames of the burning castle, and until the cries of the combatants, mingled with the howls of the wounded, were heard in the corridors of the castle and on the stairs. For now he had been seized with a nameless fear. He tried to open the door which his faithless nurses had thrown into the lock behind him. But when his feeble strength did not succeed in this, he hurried to his old playmate, the copper jug that stood in the corner, and seized the handle of it, crying piteously for his father. The idea of the jug and his father was very natural, for he had lately seen the old gentleman sitting beside him, almost exclusively with this device in his hand. But Franz von Schreckenberg no longer heard the cry of his child. It was just at the very moment when the halberd of an enemy struck him over the head, so that he fell noiselessly. The child, after screaming several times in vain for her father and his nurses, suddenly felt herself drawn away in a way, as if the jug had become a living creature that was taking it away with it. The door sprang open, and Kuno went through it, down the burning staircase without being hurt by the flames, and through the falling walls without a stone hitting him. Then he hurried forward through the courtyards towards the great gate, and Kuno soon reached the open air. Suddenly he heard beside him, from a burning side building, the cry of a boy who had often played with him in the good happy days. His name was Wolf, and he was the porter's son. Kuno had not immediately heard the voice of his old playmate when he answered him, "Here, here," and cried to him, "Hurry up, dear Wolf, and come here, or we must both be burned." The latter did not hesitate to spring out of his hiding place, a large stone water trough, and came running up quickly. He had scarcely grasped Kuno's garment when the invisible power, who had carried them down the burning stairs in flight, began to work again, and hurried away with the two boys with the greatest speed. They came down the mountain, and did not know how they ran a long distance across the field without tiring, and when they sometimes turned round in their course to look a country from whence they had come, they saw Kuno's paternal castle in full flames, a sight at which they both burst into tears, but without stopping in their rapid run. Then they climbed other mountains, and the burning homeland behind them began to become indistinct. Soon they saw nothing more of it than a red reflection in the sky, for evening had already fallen. Now the two boys suddenly felt that they were extremely tired, and therefore looked about for a place where they could spend the night. But there was nothing to be seen far and wide but heath and forest, and mountain and valley, not a house, not even a poor barn, into which they could have crawled, so as not to have to stay the night in the open air. They sat down in the green moss under a tree, and after looking at each other very pitifully, and sighing a little, they suddenly burst into tears, and now felt for the first time what they had lost. "Oh," Kuno lamented, "where can my daddy be now? They must have killed him, and he is no longer alive." "Yes," continued Wolf, "and mine and my mother, and the little sister." All, interrupted Kuno to his companion. "Yes, all are dead, dead as a mouse." At this last word they burst into more violent tears, and sobbed for a while. But as there was no one near to pity them, and beg them not to weep any more, they soon ceased, and Wolf, who was 2 years older than Kuno, first tried to inspire his companion with other thoughts. "Yes, dear Kuno," he said, "we are so unhappy for once, and have lost everything. What is to be done now? As there is no house near to receive us, we must sleep in the open air, and we shall probably not die from it. Do you remember how your father once told us that when he was a little boy he had to go hunting, and then they all got lost. And he slept in the moss as well as the oldest squire, and it didn't hurt him. So let's try to put ourselves together tightly and see if we can't sleep in the open air. Kuno did indeed feel somewhat strengthened by the words of his companion in misfortune, and as he was just as good a hearty fellow as Wolf, he said yes, and they chose a suitable place to sleep. The copper jug, to which the two of them owed their salvation without knowing it, Kuno had hitherto held with one hand. For this vessel, his only heirloom, brought him such a vivid memory of his father's burnt house, of his father and mother, that he felt himself properly comforted by the proximity of it. After the two boys had looked around for some time in the place where they were, they discovered a hollow oak, which was covered inside with the most beautiful moss. Wolf let his companion crawl in first, so that he and the jug would have the safest and best place, but he himself lay down at the front of the entrance in order to be able to protect his little friend in case of danger. Both soon fell asleep, and as they were very tired, they did not awake until the sun rose over the distant mountains and sent one of its red, quivering rays into the tree. They sprang up, crept out of their bed, and took counsel as to what was to be done now. Kuno thought it would not be most honest to seek the way back to the burnt castle, to see if perhaps one of their father's friends was not still alive who could then help them, but Wolf rejected this proposal, explaining to his little friend that the enemies would swarm everywhere in search of prey, and that they would infallibly kill them as soon as they showed themselves. The latter made sense to poor Kuno, and they both decided to wander out into the country at random to see in what way they could help each other through. They picked some berries that were standing about for breakfast, and then went to a little brook, which was also not far from the tree. Here they drew a drink of clear water with the jug, and after they had both drunk from it, they were not a little surprised when they felt that they were quite satisfied in spite of the little they had eaten. Then they set out with fresh strength, and after they had looked around and thought about what region their home would be, they turned their backs on it and literally followed their noses in the opposite direction without any definite goal. The only thing that guided them at best was the better or worse ground over which they walked. Soon they made a long detour, so as not to have to wade through the middle of a swamp. Soon they walked for a long time on the edge of a forest, which was surrounded by wide moats, and so the toil was endless all day long. The sun was already sinking, and still they had no prospect of spending the night better than the last. Nor did the region around it have the appearance of being inhabited by human beings, for one saw no fruit fields or fruit trees, but nothing but sad heaths, through which here and there a half-dried brook wound miserably. What one saw now and then of the woods were black, gloomy firs, which hung their branches sadly on the ground, and sighed and lamented aloud when the fresh wind swept over them. It was now getting darker and darker, and the two boys, quite tired, sat down by one of these little streams, and as they had found no berries on their march today to satisfy their hunger, they drew some water from the spring with their pitcher. But how astonished they were when they took a sip, and made the same discovery, about which they had not thought much in the morning, namely, that they were as satisfied with the little water they had drunk as if they had eaten the best food. They now fell asleep again comforted, woke up the next morning strengthened and refreshed, and continued their march. It was now the third day that they had left their home, and unfortunately they did not yet know what to do for the future. They walked over the heaths, through the fir forests, behind which new heaths came, and so on, until the afternoon. Just as the sun began to descend again, they saw before them in the distance a mountain overgrown with other fresh greenery, and not with firs, where they finally hoped to find people who would help them. They strengthened themselves again with a drink of fresh water, and walked so briskly that by the fall of night they had reached the mountains that lay before them. Their hope of finally finding people and houses there who would grant them a different place to camp than the one they had hitherto had did not make them camp for the night in the open air at the foot of the mountains, but they began to climb briskly upwards in order to be able to look around for a town or a house above. Behind them, the full moon rose and illuminated their path in the best possible way, a circumstance which served the two boys particularly well tonight, for the higher they climbed, the worse their path became. Soon they were confronted by large rocky peaks, between which they only found a way after a long search. Then again, the branches of the trees and shrubs were so closely intertwined that they could not pass through, but had to climb over them. After 1,000 such difficulties, they finally reached the height of the mountains and prostrated themselves wearily under an oak tree to rest for a while. Before them the forest descended again, and it seemed to them as if the mountain range on which they were enclosed in a great arc a quiet valley. And so it was. After they had rested for some time, Wolf climbed up to the oak under which they were, and peered about him to the best of his ability. But as much as he tried to discover a house or the like, he saw nothing but the tops of the trees. He saw something flashing out of the green of the forest here and there, but when he looked more closely, he perceived that it was a large round lake on which the rays of the moon fell. Kuno, who did not want to be satisfied with the disconsolate answer, also climbed the tree, but took his jug with him, for he loved it too much to let it go for a moment. When he had reached the top of the tree, the two boys let their eyes wander about together, and although Wolf repeatedly assured them that there was nothing to be seen, Kuno suddenly exclaimed that he saw a little house down there and pointed to it with his finger. However much Wolf wiped his eyes and looked until the trees seemed to dance around him, he saw nothing until, quite by chance, he laid his hand on the copper jug and then saw the little house of which Kuno had spoken. He could not be sufficiently surprised that he had not noticed a thing that was now so clearly before him. After he had now taken the precaution and thrown his cap down from the tree towards the region where the little house lay, they both descended happily and hurried on their way there. They went down into the valley more easily than they had climbed the mountain before, but they had to walk a few more hours before they reached the little house which seemed so close to them from the tree above. Now they came out of the forest into an open square covered with turf, in the middle of which lay a small garden, and in it the little house. The little garden was bordered by a fence consisting of snow-white and rose-red corals, the tips of which ended in silver snake heads. They walked around this wonderful fence several times and searched in vain for a long time for a little gate that would allow them to enter. They were already about to climb over when Kuno, who was carrying the copper jug in his arms, touched the coral with it as he passed, and now suddenly a little door sprang open and let them enter. Behind them it struck again, and though they now knew the spot where it was, the corals were so wonderfully arranged that they vainly tried to discover the opening by which they had entered. If they had been sufficiently astonished at this, they were almost beside themselves with astonishment at the sight of the little garden itself, which they could pretty much overlook in the clear moonlight. The paths that wound between the flower beds shone as if they were made of silver that had been crushed to dust. Alas! And yet this splendour was nothing compared with the flowers themselves that grew on the beds. It was as if diamonds, rubies, emeralds, pearls, gold and silver were constantly being shaken together, and it shone and shone before the eyes of the astonished boys. Because of all the splendour and splendour, it was not possible for them to take a closer look at one of these wonderful plants. Wolf also admonished his companion not to stay too long in the strange garden, but to go to the little house, so that the owner of it would not be angry if they stared so long in his property without first asking his permission. As humbly and quietly as possible, therefore they approached the little house that lay before them. It was no less beautiful and magnificent than the garden. Its 4 walls were of smooth white marble, and the windows which were in them seemed to be immense diamonds, set in gold. The roof was made of red coral, the spikes of which all grew upwards, and as there was a silver snake's head on each of these points, as on the fence, it looked as if thousands of red snakes were wriggling up there. Now the two boys stood before the golden door, and Wolf knocked modestly to make himself known to the owner. He knocked once, twice, yes, 3 times, but no one came to open the door for him. As they thought that everything was fast asleep inside, they throbbed harder, and as this was of no avail, the two boys raised their voices and begged as imploringly as possible that they were a couple of poor children who had lost their way and did not know where to spend the night. All in vain. No one appeared, and not the slightest noise was heard inside. Kuno, who was very tired, sat down on the ground in front of the door, and when he put the copper jug beside him, it accidentally touched the door, which now suddenly sprang open. Wolf, who was very much astonished at this, took a step back and did not dare to step in. At last, however, both took courage, and after calling once more to the owner, who was neither seen nor heard, they entered the little house and came into a small room, where everything was furnished with the same splendour. What surprised her most, and at the same time delighted her, was the sight of 2 beds standing there. Shy and anxious, they went to one of them to see if there was not anyone lying in it. But no matter how closely they examined the silk blankets and pillows, and even looked under the beds, they found no one, whereupon, after a short consultation, in their great fatigue, they were persuaded to take a seat in these 2 beds themselves. So they undressed, crawled under the silken blankets, said their evening prayers, and soon fell into a sound sleep. As it often happens to children that they wake up earlier than at home in strange places, no matter how soft their bed is and their room so beautiful, so it happened to the 2 boys. But this morning it was probably a secondary cause that drove sleep out of their eyes earlier. As soon as the first rays of the day broke over the mountains, the windows began to flash and shine, and shot such 1,000 red, yellow, white, and green rays that a dead man would have had to awaken from them. Kuno rubbed his eyes first and looked around him with a loud exclamation of amazement. He had dreamed that they had fallen asleep again under an oak tree as before, and now awoke there, shivering and chilling through the dampness of Moses and the sharp morning air. But it was all the more agreeable to the boy when, on waking up, he felt that he was lying in a bed as fine and soft as he had hardly had at home. Wolf, who had never slept like this in his life, stretched and turned comfortably under the silken coverlet, and could hardly make up his mind to get out of bed. The curiosity which was aroused in the boys when they looked about them and saw all these strange, magnificent objects did not let them rest any longer. They sprang up, slipped into their clothes, and began to look closely at the chamber in which she had been resting. Ah! Everything was of such strange splendour. Yesterday evening in the dark they had not been able to look at everything, and were now all the more surprised when they looked closely at all the devices. The frames of the beds in which they slept seemed to them particularly strange. They were also made of gold, and the feet were made of beautiful ringed snakes which carried the frame with their heads. After the 2 had had their fill of the room, they went out into the garden, and if they had been astonished the evening before at the splendour with which the flowers bloomed there, this morning in the bright sunlight their astonishment was still greater. Alas, all that they saw here was so beautiful that they both exclaimed at the same time that they would like to spend their lives here. The surrounding valley wall was overgrown with the most lush and beautiful green, on which hung thousands of dewdrops which sparkled in the sun like diamonds. A small stream which rushed down from the top of the mountain with a loud splash gathered in a white marble basin at the bottom of the valley and flowed from it quite quietly past the beautiful little garden. After the boys had refreshed themselves with a drink of water, they decided to wander about the valley to see if they could not find any trace of the owner of the little house. They wanted to seek him out and beg him to leave them there, in return for which they would promise to keep the little garden in order, as best they could, and to be useful to him wherever they could. With this resolution, Kuno took the jug on his arm and both left the garden. They followed the course of that brook, which ran for some time through fresh green meadows, and then turned towards the forest which the two boys now saw before them, and of which the greater part of the valley seemed to consist. The two of them were so happy that they raised their voices and sang and shouted loudly. Besides, they had the object of calling the attention of their landlord, who was perhaps in the forest, to them. At first it seemed strange to them that in the leafy branches of the tall trees under which they walked, there were no birds to be heard answering them with cheerful tunes. They listened now here, now there, but then all was dead and silent, and only the echo answered their call. They went on, and at last the forest seemed to them to become a little lighter. Wolf, too, thought she saw in the distance the mirror of the lake, which she had discovered the previous evening from the mountain above. They hurried in that direction, and soon saw that they were not mistaken, for when they came out of the forest they found themselves on the edge of a large lake, the water of which was black in colour and looked rather sinister. There were no waves, and though it was high in summer, the pond looked as if it had frozen. Yes, when the wind chased down a leaf from the neighbouring trees, it did not float merrily along on the water, but as if it were afraid of it, it hopped on the surface of the lake to the other side, and only remained there on the land. The two boys sat down on a mossy stone on the shore of the lake, and did not know what to make of it. Wolf, who at home had listened to many credible and truthful tales of enchanted countries, of mermaids and elves, at home at the feasts of the squires, first came to the idea that they were in the end in such a magic valley, a conjecture which was not at all agreeable to the two of them. They began to be afraid, and as friendly and beautiful as their whole surroundings had seemed to them before, they now looked at them with suspicion and fearful looks. The silence that surrounded them, the black water by which they sat, even the beautiful little house in which they had slept, all seemed terrible to them now, for Wolf remembered a story in which the ogre or man-eater conjured up such things, and thus attracted poor children to eat afterwards as a meal. With these thoughts the two boys sat sadly, and looked before them into the water, which, though it appeared quite black, was quite transparent. They bent over the stone and looked down attentively for a long time, and Kuno, who held his jug tightly in his arms, was the first to think he saw something at the bottom of the lake. It seemed to him as if he saw walls, roofs, yes, gradually a whole stately castle, far more beautiful and larger than his father's had been. Wolf also looked and thought he saw the same thing. As they both had keen, healthy eyes, and their curiosity was greatly piqued by their first suspicion, they all gathered their attention, and found that they had not been mistaken. At the bottom of the lake there really was a large, beautiful castle with high towers and walls, and they now saw it in vague outlines, something like one sees an object through a thick fog. This discovery, however, was not suitable to dispel their fears, but it became all the more clear to them now that they were in an enchanted valley, that the evil sorcerer lived down there, and that the little house in which they had slept was the place where the sorcerer would seize them and eat them. Though these thoughts were not calculated to bring them back there, they did, as often happened to men who, instead of fleeing from a thing which seems terrible to them, must approach it again and again with a shuddering curiosity. The two got up and walked back along the brook until they saw the little house in which they had slept the day before. Restlessly as they peered about here, however much they feared to see a horrible figure appear behind some bush, there was nothing to be found of all this. The little house stood there as quietly as before, and nothing had changed inside it. They went in and searched all the corners once more, in order perhaps to find another chamber. They had suspected that there must be more than one chamber in the little house, because of the size of it from the outside, which was out of proportion to the small room. But however hard they tried to find the joints of a door in the beautiful smooth wall, it was impossible for them to do so, and they discovered nothing. After they had set themselves to work in the garden, picking little stones from the beds, and tying up some of the beautiful flowers which the wind had torn from their sticks, evening had come, and the two boys retired to rest as before, but with a far more sorrowful heart, fearing that they would be able to in the night the sorcerer would appear to put an end to her life, but nothing happened to justify this apprehension. They slept peacefully in the silken beds through the long night, and were not awakened until the next morning by the sparkling rays of the sun, which flickered in through the brightly shining windows. The boys got up again cheerfully, and their fear that they had fallen into the hands of an evil sorcerer seemed to disappear somewhat. In the absence of other food, they diligently poured their jug, which did not abandon them, but refreshed and satisfied them in the most wonderful way. Then they took each other by the hand to wander about the valley again. This time they did not turn their steps towards the Black Lake, but tried to climb up the valley wall to look around on the heights. At first they found a path here that seemed to lead upwards, but when she had followed him for a few hundred paces, he turned downhill again. It was the same with a second and third path which they found, and when the two boys finally tried to climb up without a path, and in the middle of the trees, they could not get up, but sometimes they could not get away over gigantic trees that had fallen down. Sometimes an enormous rock wall barred their way. So they toiled in vain for several hours, and at last turned back again, having decided that, as they had not succeeded in looking round the lake, they would look for a way round the lake, in order to look closely at the other side of it. As far as they could see from the shore on which they had been sitting, the lake still stretched far into the valley, but now dense bushes, between which they could only see the water shining through here and there, blocked their further view. They turned to the left side of the lake to make an attempt to walk along its shore, but they did not succeed in this project either, because this path was connected with infinite difficulties. Here the lake came up to the smooth valley wall, and did not even leave a hand's breadth of path. Their broad masses of rock hung over the water, and the two soon saw that they had to stop their discoveries on this side. As it was already beginning to get dark again, they resolved to examine the shores of the lake on the other side on the morrow, and then returned to their little house to sleep in it for the third night. The evening was so beautiful, and the two boys, excited by their unsuccessful voyages of discovery, could not possibly go to bed at once on their arrival at home. The sun sank behind the mountains, and soon the moon rose on the other side, and listened and peered down into the valley between the dark firs, as if to see where the shining sun had gone, his unfaithful lover, whom he was restlessly pursuing. The poor pale face of the moon had turned quite red from the restless hunt, and this blush did not disappear until he had risen above the mountains and saw that he could not reach the sun, and that all his efforts were in vain. The two boys lay down on the lawn behind the little house and thought of their home, and of their dear parents and friends whom they had lost forever. They told each other of the last days she had spent in the castle, with all the little details that each knew as well as the other, and yet they were talking. They described to each other the tumult of the stormers, and Kuno made clear to his comrade the great terror when he had seen the first light of the fire at the windows. So they lay there and talked and looked alternately at the valley, which lay dark before them, protected from the rays of the moon by the strong, thickly leafy trees, or at the moon itself, which rose quietly in the dark night sky. Suddenly it seemed to them as if they heard a faint tinkling and sounding from the shore of the lake, something like a finger being dragged to and fro on the rim of the glass, or as if its silver bells were ringing. As they had not heard a sound in the valley before, they listened to this strange music with the most rapt attention. She seemed to get closer and closer, and the sounds became louder and clearer. But as hard as the two tried to see anything that could cause this music, they did not notice anything at first. But now all at once Kuno beckoned to his companion to be quiet, and pointed before him into the valley, where something strangely shining appeared under the trees that stood before the lake. It was as if there were two fiery shining threads lying in the grass, slowly moving nearer. Wolf now saw the same thing, and was not a little frightened, for as he had a sharper eye than his friend, he soon recognized a few small snakes, but they shone and shone extraordinarily. As they thus moved along in the grass, the music she had heard before sounded, and it was as if it came from the grazing of the snakes' bodies on the grass. Now the two strange creatures came out of the forest, and the boys could look at them more distinctly. There were really a few snakes, but they were not so terrible to look at as usual such animals. They moved so gracefully and gracefully on the lawn, now raising their heads slightly as if to look about them, and then lowering them again to slip under the grass, seeming to like the music they were making, for though there was no particular beat in it, yet it coincided exactly with the twists and turns of the snakes. Much as the boys had been afraid at first, they soon delighted the two shining animals, and they watched with pleasure as they moved along in the dark grass. Now they were not far from the garden that surrounded the little house, and turned towards it. They touched the coral railing, passed through the little gate that opened in it, and then disappeared into the house. The boys, however, had not expected this, and they looked at each other in dismay, for they did not like it at all that the cold snakes should take possession of the beautiful little house. Wolf, however, was the first to think that the animals had perhaps more right to the house than they did, and remembered a story of how swans had a little house in the middle of a pond, which had been well furnished with beds and all kinds of household goods, and where they had spent the nights. Dwelling on this thought, such a tremendous curiosity was aroused in the boys that, in spite of the fear of an evil spell that might threaten them, they got up from their seats and crept on tiptoe to the little house in the greatest possible silence, to see what the two snakes might do there. The coral gate did not open before them until Kuno, after many a vain attempt, accidentally struck it with his copper jug. They crept through the little garden and stood at one of the windows to look into the little house. Then they saw the two snakes reaching up one of the marble walls with their heads, and suddenly a door opened there, which led into another chamber, much more magnificent than the first. There the walls were made of pure gold, and although there were no windows to let in light from without, a fist-thick ruby hung from the ceiling, which filled the little room with a dark red, very bright gleam of light, by which they could distinguish that the room was filled with all kinds of beautiful utensils. There were small tables, armchairs, washbowls, and cups, and all of them were made of metal, and decorated with many ingenious figures. It occurred to Wolf by chance that the jug that Kuno was carrying on his arm would fit exactly with the other things in the room, for there stood on a table a similar vessel, only not as large and beautiful as this jug. The snakes curled up one of the tables, and slipped into one of the washbains, which was filled with a rose-red liquid, in which they bathed for a time. Then they left the pool again and glided down to the earth. There they raised themselves up to each other, the snake skin fell from their bodies, and they suddenly changed into a couple of beautiful young girls of about 10 or 12 years of age, who fell into each other's arms, crying loudly. The two boys watched this transformation with the greatest astonishment. They felt that there was a spell at play here, but they were more pleased than frightened by it. The two girls looked so friendly and beautiful that they were not at all afraid of them. Rather, they would have liked to approach them to find out why they had been turned into serpents a few moments ago. Kuno was particularly in favor of going into the room and discovering himself to the two girls, but Wolf stopped him by remarking that this would not be at all proper. Rather, it was their duty to withdraw quietly from there, and to leave the little house entirely to the two princesses, for it was evident from the little crowns they wore on their heads, to which they were certainly more right than they were. At first Kuno could not make up his mind to leave the window, but watched attentively the two princesses, who now left the small room and stepped into the larger one where the two beds stood. There they sat down on a chair, clasped each other with their arms, and talked to each other most eagerly, many a tear flowing from their eyes, without anyone outside being able to understand anything of their speeches. After they had sat thus for some time, they fell into each other's arms again, kissed each other, and each slipped into one of the beds in which the boys had slept the night before. As at this moment the moon, which had hitherto illuminated the first room with its white rays, sank behind one of the mountains, it became quite dark in the little house, and the boys saw no more. Astonished at what had happened that evening, they left the garden, so as not to disturb the pretty little mistresses of the cottage, and lay down in the moss at the edge of the forest, with the firm intention of waking before daybreak, and then seeing what would become of the little snakes, or rather of the two princesses. But was their sleep so sound, because they had run about a great deal today, or did the guardian angel who watches over the orphaned children not think it advisable for them to carry out their purpose, and therefore let them sleep longer than they had planned? Enough when they awoke, the sun was already high in the sky, and when they hurried quickly to the little house, it was as empty as it had been on the first day. They examined everything in the beds, under the chairs and even in the drawers of the table, but they found no more trace of the two princesses than they found, in the most careful search, the door which led into the other room. They walked about sullenly, and they were both now sorry that they had not knocked at the window last night, at least modestly, and pretended to be a couple of poor lost wanderers coming to this region for the first time. As they lived in the hope that the two beautiful snakes would come back another evening, they resolved to do so then, and, as the matter could not be changed for the day, began their journey through the valley anew. They went down to the lake and this time tried to go on the left side of its shore. They succeeded better here than yesterday on the other side. They walked along an easy path, and soon came to the spot which they had seen from the beginning of the lake, and where, as it seemed, the water was lost between the trees. It was indeed so. The two shores of the lake, overgrown with thick bushes, came closer together and formed a corner which the boys could not avoid, for the path suddenly stopped here and led to a rugged rock wall, where they could of course go no further. After she had looked round in all directions, and had made the vain attempt to climb the cliff, Wolf suddenly discovered a small staircase beside her, which led down to the lake, and in front of which a boat was rocking on the black water. As much as the two boys would have liked to sit down in the little boat to continue their voyage of discovery on the water, since it was no longer possible on land, the fear of the Black Lake kept them from their venture at first. Kuno in particular advised against it, for it was not so much the lake itself as the castle at the bottom of it, which she saw so clearly, that was uncanny to him. "Just think, dear Wolf," he said, when we were sailing on the black water, and suddenly a door opened down there in the castle, and a horseman came up to ask us, "Who are we and what do we want?" Or if the boat suddenly sank and we fell down there into the courtyard of the castle, and had to stay there forever with the people who are probably enchanted. Wolf at first agreed with these reasons, but as he was anxious to reach the other end of the lake, to see if there were any people there, he soon succeeded in persuading his friend, and inspiring courage in him to undertake the voyage on the water. After some talking back and forth, they finally descended the stairs and sat down in the boat, but for a long time they tried in vain to loosen the chain, which hung with a strong lock on the stairs. At last Kuno, who was sitting at the end of the boat, in a new attempt to open the lock, brushed against the chain with the jug which he carried on his arm, which immediately broke and gave the boat its free course. Wolf had often seen at home that the squires, when they sailed along the shore of the great castle pond without oars to pull in the fishing nets that had been exhibited, seized the bushes and branches of the trees with their hands and thus helped themselves forward. He wanted to do the same when the chain was broken, but almost fell into the water in the attempt, for the boat was not so soon loosened when it suddenly turned away from the shore, and, to the astonishment and terror of the two boys, drove into the middle of the lake without oars or sails. In vain their attempt to bring the boat to a halt by shouting, as one does to a naughty horse, was a means which they really tried in their heart's anguish. Wolf, especially, when he felt that he was being carried away irresistibly, begged the boat, first with the most polite flattery, and then even with insults, to stop and turn back, all in vain. He shot irresistibly. They had already passed the place where the shores of the lake came a little nearer together, and now they came to the other side of the corner of the rock which had stopped them before, and saw before them the whole lake, which was once more as large and wide as the part behind them. Although the boat moved swiftly on the water, its point did not cut through the waves, but it was as if the vessel were gliding over the water as if on a sheet of ice. Nor was the splashing of the approaching waves heard on the sides, nor the merry murmur of the water. Everything was quiet and quiet. At first the boys feared lest the lake, if they were in the midst of it, would expand in all directions to infinity, and leave them alone as on a wild, lonely sea. But that was not the case. The shores remained unmoved, and the boys only discovered that the boat was heading for an island that seemed to lie at the end of the Black Lake. This island could not be very large, but the bushes that grew around it seemed impenetrable. There stood tree after tree, forming a green wall with the thickest foliage, and between them grew low shrubs, interweaving the whole still more. Soon the boys saw that there was also a small staircase on the island that led down to the lake, and there the boat turned. Soon he had reached the shore and drove violently between the thick reeds that grew in front of the stairs to it, where he stopped his course, turned, and pressed his length against the lowest step, and lay quietly. Wolf had first recovered from his amazement and terror, sprang onto the beach and helped his comrade out, to whom the adventure, as it took place without danger or terror, did not seem unpleasant either, and who had even enjoyed the trip on the water very much. They discussed what was to be done next, and Kuno thought that the best thing would be to give the boat a good word, so that it would turn around and take them back to the other side of the lake, for there would not be much special and strange to be seen here on this island. Wolf, on the other hand, was of the opinion that since they were there, they should also penetrate into the interior of it, for it did not seem credible to him that the boat should have brought them here against their will without cause. He also persuaded his friend, and they both walked along the shore to find an entrance through the thick bushes. But they did not succeed. They went round the island several times, examining the tree wall very closely to see if they could not find a small hole through which they could slip, but in vain. There must be a spell here, for it was as if the branches pressed closer together when one of the two tried to crawl through. Amid these futile efforts, it was noon. The sun was high in the sky, and the boys sat down on the beach of the island to recover from all the running around. They were also thirsty and hungry, and as there was no brook near from which they could draw, Wolf proposed that they should try the water of the lake. He scooped a jug full of it, took a good sip, and finding that the water tasted very good, he handed it to Kuno, who could not bring himself to put it to his lips. He thought of the castle at the bottom of the lake, and that perhaps there were enchanted people lying there, and in these reflections he assured him that he would rather suffer hunger and thirst than drink of the black water. He took the pitcher and poured the water into the bushes behind him. But who can describe the astonishment of the two when they saw that as soon as the water had touched the branches, they moved away from each other and allowed a free passage. The boys jumped up, and after looking at each other for some time with surprised looks, Wolf stepped into the bushes, and Kuno followed him. They walked a few paces under the trees, which seemed to stand here without any order. But they soon discovered a path at their feet, along which stood small groups of trees and shrubs on the right and left, which it was evident that an artful hand had arranged them in this way. They followed this path, which led into the interior of the island, and in a short time had left the thick bushes behind them, and stood on an open lawn, at the sight of which they stopped, as if captivated with a loud exclamation of astonishment. There they saw a large table, at which sat 20 or 30 men, who, although it looked as if they were engaged in merry drinking and chatting, were all rigid and motionless. At first the two thought that their sudden entrance had taken the stately company by surprise for a moment, and had kept them in the position in which they happened to be. Kuno turned to escape, but Wolf held him back and watched this strange feast breathlessly with wide-open eyes. Nothing moved, and the figures sat as rigid and stiff as if they had been hewn out of stone. Wolf, whose courage returned, first made a faint noise, then coughed and cleared his throat louder, and when all this was without success, he cried aloud, "Hello, hello," and at last, when Kuno saw that no one was stirring, he joined in the shouting. When the boys, for their own consolation, saw that their efforts to awaken the rigid company were in vain, they stepped out of the bushes altogether, and cautiously approached the table to take a closer look at the strange apparition. It was as if a company of honourable knights had been surprised by an evil curse in the middle of a feast, and had been turned to stone. At the top of the table, on which stood large tankards, goblets, and jugs with big bellies, sat an old, stately man in the most splendid armour, with a crown on his head, and behind him were 2 pages, one of whom seemed to give an order to one, while the other handed him the drinking cup. There was something at once so grave and good-natured in the old man's face that it must have inspired confidence in everyone, and the 2 boys were very sorry that he, like the rest, seemed to be made of stone and had no friendly look or answer for them. The knights, who sat at the table to the right and left of him, seemed to be absorbed in eager conversation. Some of them had grasped the tankard with one hand, and were leaning on the table or their swords with the other, looking attentively into each other's faces, and these faces, though hard and stiff, had retained such a lively expression that one could see exactly which one had spoken and which had listened. There sat a few who held each other with their arms around each other and looked up. The expression of her face betrayed an extraordinary gaiety, and when one saw her half-open, smiling mouth, one might have thought that a merry drinking song was floating on her lips. The 2 boys walked round the table in amazement, and when they stepped behind the old man with the crown, they saw that to the right and left of him at the table stood a few delicately carved chairs, but they were empty. Kuno, who was not as courageous as Wolf, was a little frightened, and took care not to come too close to the company, and kept more to the bushes that surrounded the lawn. But suddenly he started back with a loud cry, for he suddenly saw a large dog lying at his feet, while a few horses, standing under the trees and held by the bridle by a squire, looked down at him. Wolf hurried up in surprise, but it soon became apparent that these horses, of which there were several more to be seen in the bushes, as well as many squires and dogs, were just as rigid and motionless as their masters. The boys now walked round the table, and at the end of it saw a few figures sitting, which attracted their special attention. They were already elderly men, and one of them looked inquiringly down the lake, and his peeping features had a faint touch of terror and horror. He held one hand to his ear, as if he were listening carefully to something, and with the other hand he had grasped the shoulder of the man next to him to attract his attention. The latter, however, did not allow himself to be disturbed, but sat leaning back in his chair, and put a large cup to his mouth, which he seemed to empty with much pleasure. Wolf and Kuno looked at these 2 for a long time, and exhausted themselves in conjecturing that one of the old gentlemen might have looked. Kuno looked over his shoulder and tried to give his eyes the same direction to see something special there, but he saw nothing but the black mirror of the lake. Wolf, however, looked more closely at the other gentleman, and regretted infinitely that he had probably been disturbed in the midst of drinking. Nor did he fail to make his ridiculous remarks about the old gentleman, and suggested that he must have been the most thirsty of the whole dinner party. The fear which the two boys had at first had vanished altogether, and as they could not figure out whether these figures were carved out of stone by an artful master, or so transformed by magic, they took the matter as it was, and amused themselves for a time by looking at the weapons, the drinking utensils, the clothes, and finally the horses and dogs. Wolf became quite wanton, and climbed on one of the war horses, and when Kuno saw that he looked quite handsome up there, he climbed on another himself, and both shouted with joy. After trying for some time to set the horses in motion by shouting, or kicking them with their heels, which would have given them the deadliest fright, if this had really happened, they descended again and engaged in other occupations. They sat down on the two empty chairs at the top of the table, but soon left them again, for the face of the old man with the crown looked too awe-inspiring to them. Then they strolled round the table, and Wolf placed himself in front of the drinker, and at last, laughing, suggested that he should pour some water into the old gentleman's cup, so that he could quench his thirst. Kuno did not like this idea at all, and jumped down to the lake with his copper jug, where he filled it with water. Then Wolf received him, raised himself on his tiptoe, and poured the cup as full as was possible from the crooked posture in which the knight held it, but so that the water moistened its lips. Rejoicing in their merry deed, the two stood there and laughed aloud. But suddenly Wolf stopped laughing and stared at the knight's face. Kuno also saw him and clung to Wolf with a loud exclamation of horror. Who can describe the terror of the two when they saw how the lips slowly parted in the stone, cold face, and drank the water which Wolf had poured into the cup, how the eyes, which had formerly been so dead, slowly came to life, took on shine and colour, and stared before them with a strange expression. As the water slowly flowed through the throat, the breast of the stone figure began to breathe and life appeared in all the limbs of the body. The old knight drew a few deep breaths in succession, heaved a few sighs, and laid his hand with the cup slowly down on the table. Then he turned his neck, and looked with a look of wonder and terror at his companion, whose cold stone hand that lay on his shoulder he now felt with astonishment. The two boys who had been frightened had sunk on their knees, and looked up at the knight with pale faces and clasped hands, and though they could not utter a word, it was evident from the movement of their lips that they implored forgiveness for their rash deed. The revived man, after seeing the whole party at table with the same astonishment with which he had looked at the man next to him, now noticed the two kneeling children, and sprang up from his chair with an exclamation of surprise. Wolf, who now saw that she had not done so bad a deed after all, in that the former block of stone had become a properly living man, was the first to regain his composure, and told the knight in short words who they were, and what they had done, until the moment when they had accidentally brought him back to life. He looked at the two children in amazement, and listened to their story with the same astonishment with which they looked at him. When the subject of the jug came up, he approached attentively, and when Kuno held it up and showed it, the knight uttered a loud cry of delight, pressed now the boys, now the jug to his breast, and cried aloud, with tears rolling down his grey beard, "Now all misery has come to an end." Reluctant as Kuno was to part with his jug, he left it to the knight, who hung it on his arm, and as evening was already falling, invited the boys to follow him. They all three went to the beach of the island, descended the stairs, and sat down in the boat, which immediately turned round, and, without the aid of oars or sails, swam hastily in the direction in which the two boys had come this morning. Soon they reached the other shore, alighted, and led the knight to the place of the lake, where the castle could be clearly seen at the bottom of it. Then they sat down, and the old knight looked down for a long time, and waved his hand joyfully. "Yes," he cried aloud. "Soon you poor people down there will be delivered, and soon the castle will emerge again from the black water and look proudly and stately into the valley as before." Wolf and Kuno, who listened attentively to the knight's speeches, were very curious to know what was the matter with the castle down there, and Wolf had the courage to ask the knight about it. The latter looked thoughtfully into the lake for a while, as if he wanted to see something down there. Then he turned to the boys and told them the history of the castle as follows. "The valley in which we are not long ago belonged to King Dagobert, whom you saw sitting on the island at the top of the table with the crown on his head. He lived happily in his castle, which, however, did not lie at the bottom of the lake as it does now, but was pleasantly hidden among the surrounding mountains, deep in the valley, in the midst of beautiful gardens and fertile meadows. The king was cheerful and contented, for he had everything that can make life pleasant. Unfortunately, his wife had died for him, but she had borne him 2 daughters, who had the good fortune to have 2 of those mighty beings who are called fairies standing at their cradles. They took the place of motherhood with the little princesses, and protected and cared for them so well that they grew up vigorously in abundance of health and excellent beauty. Instead of gold, silver, and precious stones, which they could have given them as a godfather's gift, one of them blessed the well of the castle courtyard and let its water be healing, both for all diseases, and also for that evil from which no man can escape, old age, in which even the eldest old man, after a drink from that spring, if not regained the freshness and appearance of youth, could live for many years in good health and cheerfulness. The other gave a copper pitcher. It is the same one which I have recovered with your help to draw with it alone that salutary water. When the 2 princesses had grown up, the fairies were obliged to leave the valley by order of their queen, at which time they did not conceal from the king that through the protection they had given his children, an evil but powerful spirit, which always sought to spoil their works, had become aware of them, and would not delay here either, if it were possible for him to cause mischief. Since all things that arise from the dark womb of the earth are subject to him, he also has power over all water that springs from the ground, and thus also over the floods of the salutary well. In order to counteract this power, which, as far as it was possible, only does evil, the king should hold the inconspicuous copper jug in high esteem and never allow any other vessel than this to be drawn from the well in the courtyard, for only in this way could the mighty subterranean spirit be kept in check and its strength taken away, lest it add an evil spell to the water, or let the floods flow out so violently that they would bring ruin to all who lived in the valley. The king promised to observe this regulation carefully, and the fairies parted, having once more wished all blessings upon the 2 princesses. Then the king had the old, inconspicuous well surrounded in the most costly manner with polished marble, and a roof was built over it of the most beautiful rosewood, which had only one small door, to which the king had a very artificial lock made, the key of which he kept constantly in his belt, and never gave it away. As he was not stingy, and gladly allowed everyone to enjoy the healing water free of charge, old and young, rich and poor were allowed to come to the castle courtyard at certain hours, where King Dagobert himself came to the well, took the castle away with his own hand, and took care that no other vessel was drawn from the well than the copper pitcher. The water had already done so many good services in a short time that it was easy to understand how it could arouse the envy of that wicked subterranean spirit, which is why he had already tried in various forms to rob the jug or to smash the castle with which King Dagobert guarded the well. The king had already found 2 jugs of the same shape several times, so that it would have been difficult for him to recognize the right one, and perhaps he would have taken the wrong one for the true one, if the fairies had not inspired the 2 princesses with such a right feeling that they could immediately recognize the wrong and the wrong. Ambassadors of foreign kings or their princes themselves had often come to taste the water, and more than one had asked King Dagobert to let him draw the water with his own vessels. But the latter considered too well the saying of the fairies, and was too well convinced that this evil subterranean spirit would summon up all the arts at his disposal to turn the gift of the fairies to the detriment. At these words the knight paused for a moment, looked into the black lake with a sigh, and continued, "Alas, however earnestly the king was anxious to supervise this dangerous gift with the greatest possible care, he was nevertheless outwitted. It came to pass one day that King Dagobert ordered the dinner table to be set up in the place where you found me, on that island, which at that time was only a beautiful green hill that rose gently from the valley. It was a beautiful day, and after the king, with the 2 princesses and us, his retinue, had ridden over the neighbouring mountains, we reached the hill where the table was ready. The squires withdrew themselves into the bushes with the horses and dogs, and we camped around the table with merry jokes to enjoy the pleasures of the cup and the full bowls. At the top of the table sat the king, and on either side the princesses, while behind his chair several pages were ready to obey his orders. The copper jug, which he even took with him on his rides, and which then hung to one side on his saddle button, stood before him on the table. So we dined, and the air was so pure and spicy, the day so beautiful, that every man's worries and heavy thought from everyone's breast, and all was cheerful and in good spirits. Then I suddenly noticed that a ragged beggar, who had walked several times round the foot of the hill, was now ascending the hills and approaching King Scrooge. When he arrived at the table, he sank down on his knees and implored the king in the most humble and touching expressions for a drink of the healing water. The king, who would not have liked to get up from the table, asked him to come to the castle in an hour, while the beggar protested that the water could only help him at this moment, when he was in terrible pain. When the princesses saw that the king was reluctant to leave his cup at that moment, they turned to him and begged him to entrust them with the jug and the key, and let them go down to the castle alone with the beggar, to help him with a drink of water. The 2 young ladies were tired of sitting, and therefore pleaded with their father until he gave them the jug and keys. He again advised them to take the greatest caution, and made them leap down the hill into the castle. The beggar followed them. All of us who sat around the king did not have a suspicious thought of this incident. The castle was very close by, and we could follow the princesses with our eyes. They came to the well, unlocked the roof, drew the water with the copper jug, and then seemed to ask the beggar if he had not brought a vessel into which they could pour the healing water. The latter denied it, and as I put my cup to my lips at the same moment, thinking of no evil, I could not see whether the 2 princesses had given the copper jug into the beggar's hand, or whether he had snatched it from them. Enough. He swung the jug triumphantly against us, and when he sank into the earth afterwards, we saw that that mighty spirit was outwitting us. I wanted to get up from my seat, but I could not, nay, I could not even get my cup from my mouth, but rather had a feeling as if it had grown to my lips. I was surprised that none of the other nuns jumped up and rushed to the aid of the 2 princesses, who tried in vain to close the roof of the ray from the smell from the rushing flood. But all those who sat at the table seemed to be frozen at the same moment as I was. Not a sound escaped her lips, and even the barking of the dogs, who were rolling merrily in the grass, ended with a sorrowful cry, and then all around us was silent. It floated before my eyes like a thick fog, but although I could only dimly see the fountain and the courtyard of the castle, I could see that new and more powerful streams of water were rushing out of the well. The princesses cried for help, but no one sprang to their rescue. The water had already overflowed the whole courtyard and was slowly rising up the walls and valley walls. Soon there was nothing left to be seen of the 2 unfortunate princesses. Now the water was already halfway through the great tower, had now reached the roof, the top of which in the next moment only peeked out. This also disappeared, and as the water closed over it, a small trembling ring, which spread larger and larger, indicated for only a few moments that the black surface of the water had covered a stately castle. And we were frozen during that time, not only by terror, but by magic. Not only for a moment did we sit there, and could not move a limb. No, it was as if our blood was slowly turning to stone, as if all life in us was cooling off. Each remained seated in the same position. Nay, with the same expressions as he had had at the moment when the wicked magician waved the jug at us. Our eyes also darkened, and night fell before our eyes, and so we sat day after day, night after night, weeks and months, and almost 3 years have passed now. So the night told, and the two boys had listened anxiously. Night had now risen completely, and they led the knight to the little house, and told him of the 2 snakes that had changed into 2 beautiful girls the night before. Wolf spoke of the crowns which she had worn on her head, and the knight soon perceived, to his great joy, that they were the 2 princesses, and that they were still under the protection of the good fairies. For they had probably conjured up the beautiful little house here, and always helped them to leave the lake after the 3rd day to spend the night here in their natural form. The 2 boys lay down on the silken beds, the old knight on the floor, and so all 3 slept until the golden morning came. Then they awoke joyfully, and the knight began to think eagerly how he could bring about the disenchantment of the castle. Easy as this had seemed to him yesterday, he found on closer inspection that the matter had its difficulties, for he certainly had the magic that had to restrain the power of that evil spirit, but how he was to do this by means of the jug was not quite clear to him. He knew no saying, no magic word, that he could have tamed and forced the black waters. The good knight was certainly in no small embarrassment. He walked up and down the shore of the lake with the 2 boys, and was already about to sail over to the island, to make an attempt to awaken every one of the round table in the same manner as the boys had awakened him. Then suddenly another thought came to him. "Ah," thought the honourable knight, "it would be better if you would awaken your master only after the castle and valley have been disenchanted, and lie lovely before his eyes again, and even if you do not know the magic spell here, it is your duty to take a risk for your lord and king, let it end as it will." With these thoughts in mind, the knight sat down with the 2 boys in the boat, which immediately went out into the lake. When they had come to the middle of the black water, the knight suddenly stood up and said, "My dear children, sit quietly, and let me make an attempt to see if I may not succeed in removing the spell from the valley at once, by trying to close the roof of the well down there with the help of the jug, so that the flood can no longer flow out." The boys did not know what this speech of the knight meant, but uttered a loud cry of terror when they saw the knight leap down into the black lake and disappear instantly. Kuno clapped his hands together in lamentation, more at his jug than at the knight, and Wolf could not help thinking that he was another evil spirit who had now also kidnapped the jug from them. But while they were still sitting there, and Kuno was weeping loudly, they suddenly heard a loud noise far below them at the bottom of the lake, as if a door were being slammed violently, and a few moments afterwards the astonished boys noticed that a tremendous change was taking place in the lake. He began to get restless and then flare up, and they also noticed on the banks around them that the water was visibly diminishing. The sky was suddenly covered with black clouds, which in some places descended to the lake and seemed to drink up the water. Every moment the clouds grew darker from the black water, and when they were thus drunk, they moved ponderously over the mountains to make room for other thirsty clouds. The water in the lake, however, sank faster and faster. Now the top of a tower appeared close to the rocking boat, and soon they saw the whole roof of it sticking out of the water. On the top, and under the projecting roof, the 2 noticed to their astonishment crows, swallows, and other birds, which had put their heads under their wings and seemed to be asleep. But it was not as soon as the water sank down under them when they all awoke. The hawks and crows flew high into the air to see what was the matter, and the swallows darted hungrily over the water, as they had not eaten for a long time, in order to get gnats and other insects for their breakfast. Soon afterwards other walls appeared to the right and left of the boys, smaller towers with loopholes, behind which squires stood leaning against their spears, and also seemed to be asleep. But even this had not so soon. Instead of the black water, washed over the fresh air as they stretched and stretched, yawned loudly and looked about them in wonder. Now the roof of the castle itself appeared, and if the boys had already been astonished by the awakening of the birds and the squires on the towers, their astonishment now rose to the highest pitch when they saw how people and animals on every floor came to life as soon as the water had receded. There a few stable boys stuck their heads out to the sole window, and others continued to measure the oats. Deeper down, maids opened the large casement windows and let fresh air into the king's apartments. But in the kitchen the crowd was the most varied and largest, for when the enchantment had taken place 3 years ago, the master chef had just prepared the dessert for the king's table, and had been disturbed in this important business. Here the kitchen boys ran about arranging dishes full of pies, confectionery, rare fruits, and other delicious things, and the table of deckers in their gold-fringed coats hurriedly picked up the dishes to carry them up the hill. The boys sank deeper and lower. Now the whole castle stood before them, as high and stately as the knight had described, and they found themselves behind it, in a beautifully landscaped garden, and suddenly saw that the boat was floating on a small pond, on the banks of which it landed, whereupon they both sprang out into the beautiful garden. They hurried round the castle to seek out the old knight, and when they came into the courtyard of the castle, they saw him standing by the fountain of healing water, on the edge of which stood the copper jug. The 2 princesses, however, whom they had seen in the little house, lay in his arms, and all 3 wept with joy, emotion, and delight. The boys were too timid to come nearer, and kept at a modest distance, but they, too, were so moved and touched by all the wonderful things they had seen, that tears ran down their cheeks. Suddenly it began to come alive on the top of the hill, which only a few moments ago looked like an island out of the black lake. Hunting horns sounded, horses neighed, and the dogs barked. Now the shrubs bent out of each other, or were trampled down by the hoofs of the storming horses. Everything had come back to life up there, and at the head of his round table King Scrooge stormed along, shouting loudly to his children from afar. In the courtyard of the castle everyone jumped from the horses, and there was no end to the joy and delight. Then the old knight told of the 2 boys that it was they who had taken the evil curse from the valley, and presented them to the king. The latter inquired about their former fates, and as he was well acquainted with the famous family of the Schreckenbergs, he received the last offspring of the family with the greatest kindness and grace, as well as Wolf, who by his mature age and courage contributed not a little to the happy development of the story. In the king's castle the old merry life began again, and henceforth was no longer disturbed by any evil enemy. When Kuno and Wolf had been instructed in all chivalrous exercises for a few years, they undertook forays into the country to fight giants and help innocents, and one day they also visited the castle of the Schreckenbergs, and there, by God's providence, met in a miserable little house one of those old men who had stood with the old Grimace of Schreckenberg, but had not died. As he knew of the buried immeasurable treasures, he had carefully guarded them, and now handed them over to the heir, who took him with him to the court of King Dagobert. In the course of time the 2 noble knights, Kuno and Wolf, for the latter had also received the accolade of knighthood, knew how to win the love of the 2 princesses, so that old King Scrooge could not help agreeing to a double marriage. Of the copper jug the old man of the Frats von Schreckenberg told that his master had once brought it with him from a ramble, but because of his bad reputation, he had been thrown into the junk room and forgotten. King Scrooge, however, recognized in the dream which the good late Countess of Schreckenberg had had the reign of the protective fairies who had directed everything for the good. I hope you liked the story and are interested in more stories on this channel. If you liked it, subscribe to my channel and click on the bell so you don't miss any new stories in the future. Of course, I will be happy about a like.